I built a business from scratch, raised a family after losing my husband far too early, and finally sold my company for more money than I ever dreamed of having. It should have been a time of peace, of celebration, of rest. Instead, it turned into the moment I realized that even those closest to me could become my most dangerous enemies. It happened on the night of my retirement party. My home was filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Friends from my professional life were mingling with neighbors and family, all to mark the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. My son Edward insisted that the party was my due reward. "Mom, you deserve this," he had told me with his most convincing smile. And his wife Vanessa had surprised me by volunteering to host. She was arranging flowers, polishing crystal, and fluttering around the kitchen as though she had been born for entertaining. I should have recognized the danger in that sudden enthusiasm. Then it happened. A champagne glass slipped from Vanessa's hand the moment her mother, Helen, collapsed on my marble kitchen floor. Helen's body convulsed, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth, and panic rippled through the room. While others rushed forward, I remained still, my eyes fixed not on Helen, but on the glass she had just finished drinking. It was the same glass I had quietly switched with hers moments before the chipped flute I always used at parties. The one that Vanessa had carefully doctored with the contents of a small vial taken from her purse. I remember thinking only one thing as Helen struggled for air that was never meant for her. It was meant for me. 2 hours before the chaos unfolded, my kitchen had been a stage of perfect charm. Guests admired the food, the flower arrangements, and the gleaming crystal. Vanessa was everywhere at once, smiling too brightly, offering drinks as if she had suddenly discovered her calling in life. I watched her carefully. This was not the same woman who complained about stacking dishes in the dishwasher or grumbled whenever Edward asked her to host Thanksgiving. Something about her energy was too polished, too rehearsed. I stood by the bar, chatting with an old colleague, when I noticed Vanessa's hand tremble slightly as she reached into her purse. She glanced around the room, making sure no one was watching too closely, then pulled out a small vial. Her movements were quick, but not quick enough for me to miss. I saw her tilt the vial and let the liquid fall into a single glass of champagne. Not just any glass, but the one with the tiny chip on its rim, a flaw I always recognized and, oddly, cherished. It was mine. My pulse quickened, but my face betrayed nothing. Most people, I imagine, would have shouted in alarm, slapped the glass from her hand, or called the police immediately. But I had lived too long, fought through too many ruthless boardroom battles to let fear dictate my actions. Sometimes the surest way to catch a predator is to let it believe it has already won. So, I smiled at my colleague's story, nodding politely, while my mind raced ahead. Minutes later, Vanessa carried the doctored glass toward me, her expression arranged into one of concern and affection. "Beatrice, you look tired," she said softly, pressing the stem toward me. "You should have some champagne. You've earned this." Her eyes lingered on me, waiting for me to take that fatal sip. I accepted the glass with a gracious smile, thanking her as though she had done me a favor. I held it, I even lifted it to my lips, but I never drank. Instead, I waited for the right moment. When Vanessa turned her attention to a neighbor, proudly showing off a diamond bracelet, I slipped my glass onto the table beside her mother's purse. Helen, sweet and absent-minded as ever, picked it up moments later. She raised it without hesitation and took a long sip. And that was how my daughter-in-law's scheme turned against her own flesh and blood. 10 minutes later, Helen collapsed, and the room erupted into panic. As the paramedics rushed Helen out of my house that night, I kept my composure. Neighbors whispered, guests hovered nervously, and Vanessa wept so loudly you would think the tears were real. Edward paced beside her, his face pale but not with shock. No, his eyes darted toward Vanessa in a way that told me more than his words ever could. I had raised him for 32 years, and I knew how to read him. He was not a man terrified for his mother-in-law. He was a man watching his plans unravel. I excused myself from the crowd and stepped into my study, shutting the door behind me. Alone, I let the pieces click into place. Vanessa had poisoned a drink meant for me. Of that I was certain. Edward's sidelong glances, his hurried attempt to keep me from following Helen to the hospital, they confirmed what I already feared. My own son was involved. Why would he do it? The answer came quickly. Money. It always comes back to money. Edward's architectural firm had been struggling for years. He never said as much directly, but I knew. He spoke too casually about slow clients and delayed payments, as though those phrases weren't just polite ways of saying barely surviving. Vanessa, meanwhile, had her boutique jewelry business, more hobby than livelihood. The store existed to fund her shopping habits and keep her busy, not to turn a profit. They lived like royalty in a house 3 times more expensive than their income could justify, with luxury cars parked in the driveway and credit card statements that probably burned with red ink. I had helped, of course. What mother wouldn't? A down payment here, tuition there. A generous check whenever Edward sighed heavily and Vanessa dabbed her eyes about unexpected expenses. When I added it all in my head, I realized I had given them nearly $200,000 over the years. Never loans, always gifts. I had called it generosity. Now I saw the truth. They had considered it advance payment on the inheritance they couldn't wait for. The thought tightened my chest, not with fear but with sorrow. Edward had once been the boy who brought me hand-picked flowers from the yard, who stayed up late building castles of blocks at my feet. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man willing to watch his wife poison me for a fortune. I sat at my desk staring at the dark window, listening to the muffled chaos in the rest of the house. For 70 years I had survived cutthroat deals, hostile takeovers, and competitors who would gladly see me ruined. None of that prepared me for this, the day I realized the greatest threat to my life wasn't outside enemies, but my own family. The hospital waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. I sat in a stiff plastic chair, keeping my distance but close enough to observe. Helen lay behind closed doors, sedated and surrounded by doctors who whispered about toxins and blood tests. Meanwhile, Vanessa paced the room like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking against the floor, in a rhythm of nervous desperation. Every so often she stopped to wipe her eyes, producing fresh tears on demand. She looked like an actress mid-performance, and the audience was anyone gullible enough to believe her grief. Edward, in contrast, sat rigid with his phone buzzing constantly in his hand. He glanced at it but rarely replied, as if every new message was a burden. When I looked at him, he looked away too quickly. My son had never been good at hiding his conscience. His silence told me more than words could have. "This is just terrible," Vanessa said for the 5th time, pressing a hand to her chest. My poor mom. One minute she was laughing, the next she just collapsed. I can't understand how this happened. Her voice cracked, but her eyes betrayed her. They were not the eyes of a daughter terrified for her mother. They were the eyes of a woman calculating what went wrong. I leaned forward, my tone soft and sympathetic. These things are often mysterious. It's fortunate she didn't drink much of that champagne. Just a few sips and she collapsed. The words slid out as if casual, but I watched Vanessa's reaction closely. She froze, if only for a second, before covering it with a weak laugh. "Champagne. You think that caused it?" she asked quickly. Her voice trembled in a way that revealed more than she intended. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," I said, waving the thought away, though my eyes stayed on hers. Just me noticing patterns. But her hands shook as she lifted a paper cup of coffee to her lips, and I knew my guess had struck too close to the truth. 3 hours later, a doctor emerged to tell us Helen was stable. They hadn't identified the exact substance, but it was clear she had ingested poison. Vanessa pressed her palms together in mock relief. Edward exhaled like a man who had just been handed a temporary reprieve. I simply folded my hands in my lap, already deciding that whatever came next I would be ready. Driving home from the hospital, I couldn't shake the images replaying in my mind. Vanessa's sudden pallor when I mentioned champagne, Edward's stiff silence, the way they seemed united in their unease. It was enough to tell me what I didn't want to admit. This wasn't just Vanessa's scheme. Edward, my own son, was part of it. That thought opened a floodgate of memories. For years I had been the one to steady their lives when they stumbled. When Edward and Vanessa wanted a bigger house in a better neighborhood, I wrote the check for the down payment. When their daughter was born and they insisted public schools wouldn't do, I paid the tuition for a private academy. There were smaller things, 2 credit card bills just this once, vacation expenses they swore they'd cover later but never did, business shortfalls that magically disappeared after one call from me to the bank. Each time I told myself I was helping. Each time I believed I was simply doing what any mother would. But generosity can become a trap. Somewhere along the way, what I saw as gifts they began to view as entitlement. Edward would sigh about temporary struggles and Vanessa would look at me with tearful eyes until my checkbook came out. It wasn't gratitude I saw in their faces anymore, it was expectation. And I gave, because it was easier to soothe them than to say no. Now, as I replayed Helen collapsing on my kitchen floor, I wondered how long they had been plotting. Did they sit in their grand living room, surrounded by furniture I had helped pay for, whispering about the fortune they could claim, if only I were gone. Did Edward, the boy who once placed dandelions in a jar on my bedside table, nod in agreement as his wife described how simple it would be to make me look weak, frail, and replaceable? A sharp ache filled my chest, not fear, not anger, but grief. Grief for the son I thought I had raised, grief for the years of love and sacrifice that had twisted into resentment and greed. I had once believed the hardest moment of my life was losing my husband, but now, staring at the shadows of my empty house, I realized there was something worse. The deepest pain was not widowhood, nor aging, nor loneliness. It was betrayal by the very child you had devoted your life to protecting. The next morning I drove downtown to the office of Thomas Green, my attorney of nearly 2 decades. Thomas had been with me through the toughest moments of my career, the lawsuits, the contract disputes, the estate planning after my husband died. If there was anyone I could trust now, it was him. His office, all polished mahogany and shelves of leather-bound books, smelled faintly of coffee and order. It felt safe, a stark contrast to the storm inside me. He rose to greet me, adjusting his glasses. "Beatrice, I heard your party ended with an ambulance. What happened?" I told him everything. From Vanessa's nervous glance around the kitchen, to the small vial slipping into my chipped champagne flute, to Helen collapsing on the floor. I didn't leave out Edward's role, the way he tried to keep me from the hospital, the way his silence screamed louder than words. By the time I finished, Thomas's pen had stilled on the page. "You're certain about what you saw?" he asked carefully. "As certain as I am that I'm sitting here," I replied. My voice didn't tremble. I needed him to see I wasn't confused or exaggerating. I was clear. He leaned back, tapping the pen against his lips. "The problem is proof. Without testing that champagne, Vanessa can claim she added something harmless. Even if poison is confirmed, she might argue it wasn't meant for you at all. She could say it was a supplement for her mother or a misunderstanding." I nodded slowly. "Then we make sure there's no misunderstanding. I need protection, legal and otherwise." Thomas's eyes sharpened. "Then we take 2 paths. First, we protect your assets. At your age, Edward and Vanessa could try to claim you're no longer capable of managing your finances. They might attempt to petition for guardianship. Once they control your person, they control your money." "So, what do I do?" I asked. "We'll arrange for a formal competency evaluation by a respected geriatric psychiatrist. That record will make it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge your decisions. Next, we restructure your estate. We'll set up a trust that secures your assets and limits what your son can access. You can even make provisions that trigger audits if anyone attempts unauthorized withdrawals." "And what about my safety?" I pressed. "They tried once. What stops them from trying again?" Thomas pulled a folder from his drawer. "Security. Cameras, motion detectors, panic systems that link directly to the police. I know a firm that installs them for high-net-worth clients. It's discreet and effective." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Do it. All of it." For 2 hours we worked through documents, medical directives, trust structures, clauses that would ensure my money went to charities if anyone tried to declare me incompetent. By the time I left his office, the fog in my chest had cleared. My son and his wife thought they could corner me, strip me of power and dignity. What they didn't understand was this: I had spent a lifetime surviving predators in boardrooms. This time the predators were closer to home, but my response would be the same. I would fight back and I would win. 2 days later, my doorbell rang. Through the newly installed security monitor, I saw Edward and Vanessa standing on my porch. They carried a leather briefcase and the strained expressions of people who had rehearsed every word they were about to say. I opened the door with a calm smile and invited them in, leading them to the living room where the morning light fell across polished wood floors. "Mom, we need to talk," Edward began, his voice unusually formal. Vanessa perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture stiff, her eyes darting to the security camera in the corner. I let them squirm before settling into my favorite chair. Vanessa slid a stack of papers onto the coffee table. "We've been thinking about your safety. After what happened to my mother, it's clear you shouldn't be alone. We found a wonderful retirement community, Sunset Manor. It's more like a resort, really. Activities, medical staff, beautiful grounds. You'd be happy there." Edward nodded quickly. "It would give us peace of mind knowing you were cared for. Just until we're sure you're safe." I tilted my head, studying their earnest expressions. "And this paperwork?" "Standard procedure," Edward said. He pushed forward one document, power of attorney. It just gives me authority to handle your financial affairs if something happens. The facility requires it. I lifted the paper, scanning the dense legal language. To anyone else it might look routine, but I knew better. With my signature, Edward would have immediate access to my accounts, investments, and decisions. I let the silence stretch until Vanessa filled it. It's just precaution, she said softly. At your age, anything could happen. At your age. The phrase hung heavy between us. I forced a smile. You're absolutely right. Anything could happen, which is why I had Thomas prepare these for me. I pulled out a separate set of documents from my desk drawer, duplicates that looked identical but were carefully crafted to grant power of attorney over an account containing exactly $1. Edward's eyes lit with relief. So you've decided? Yes, I said, sliding the papers across the table. I signed everything this morning. I think you're right. It's time for a new chapter. Vanessa exhaled, her shoulders dropping in visible relief. Oh, Beatrice, you won't regret this. Truly. We spent the next half hour going through account numbers and details she eagerly typed into her laptop. They looked like children unwrapping presents on Christmas morning. When they finished, I added casually, one more thing. My attorney will be dropping by to finalize tax implications, should be here any moment. The doorbell rang right on cue. But it wasn't Thomas Greene. It was Detective Morrison and another officer, badges glinting in the light. Mrs. Caldwell, she said firmly, we need to speak with you about the suspected poisoning at your party. The room froze. Vanessa's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Edward stood too quickly, knocking into the coffee table. What's this about? The detective stepped inside. The champagne from your party was tested. It contained oleander extract, a deadly poison. The glass with the highest concentration was intended for your mother, Miss Caldwell. She turned her gaze squarely on Vanessa. We also discovered a life insurance policy you took out on your mother-in-law 6 months ago. Vanessa gasped. That's insane. Why would I poison my own mother or Beatrice? Her voice cracked into hysteria, but the mask was gone. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but sharp. Because I saw you, Vanessa. I watched you pour that poison into my glass. I switched it. That's why your mother nearly died instead of me. Edward's head snapped toward his wife, horror dawning in his eyes. You actually did it? Detective Morrison pulled out handcuffs. Vanessa Caldwell, you are under arrest for attempted murder. As they led her out, Vanessa's eyes blazed with fury, fixed on me. You think you've won, Beatrice? She hissed. But you've destroyed your own son's life. I met her gaze evenly. No, Vanessa, you did that yourself. The trial that followed was swift. The toxicology reports were irrefutable, and the life insurance policy sealed Vanessa's fate. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, her glamorous lifestyle exchanged for a prison uniform and cold cement walls. I almost pitied her, but every time I remembered her hand slipping that vial into my champagne, the pity vanished. Edward's role was more complicated. He insisted he hadn't known about the poison, and perhaps that was true. But he couldn't deny the conspiracy, the research into nursing homes, the push for power of attorney, the payments to a questionable psychiatrist prepared to declare me incompetent. The court gave him 3 years for his part in the scheme. Watching my only son led away in handcuffs was a pain deeper than I can describe. Yet pain and justice often walk hand in hand. When the dust settled, I turned back to what mattered most, protecting the life I had built. With Thomas Greene's help, I finalized the trust that ensured Edward would never again have unfettered access to my money. Instead of a vast inheritance, he would receive a modest annual stipend, enough to live but not enough to squander. The bulk of my fortune was redirected to medical research and scholarships, causes that would outlive me. The house felt quieter without Edward's visits, without Vanessa's forced smiles, but it also felt safer. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night, knowing my security system stood guard, and my finances were sealed beyond manipulation. I had lost a son to greed, but I had regained something priceless, my independence. The price of betrayal was high. Vanessa lost her freedom. Edward lost his future. And I lost the illusion that love alone could shield me from harm. But in its place, I found a sharper truth. Strength doesn't fade with age. If anything, it grows, sharpened by experience, polished by survival. At 70, I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is refusing to be anyone's victim, even if the enemy sits at your own table. Months have passed since that night, yet the memories remain vivid. Sometimes while sitting in my garden, I think about how close I came to losing everything, not just my fortune, but my dignity, my freedom, even my life. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from within your own walls, and I had to accept that my own son allowed greed to blind him to love. That truth will never stop hurting, but hurt does not have to mean defeat. I choose to see it differently. The ordeal reminded me that growing older does not mean growing powerless. At 70, I was tested in the harshest way possible, and I proved to myself that I was stronger than I ever imagined. I secured my legacy, protected my independence, and ensured that those who tried to strip me of everything would instead face the consequences of their choices. What I want anyone listening to take away is this: kindness is not weakness. Giving is not the same as surrendering. But generosity must be paired with boundaries. Love, even the love of a mother for her child, cannot justify allowing yourself to be used, manipulated, or endangered. We all deserve respect, safety, and the right to live life on our own terms, no matter our age. So if you've ever been made to feel powerless, remember my story. Stand firm. Protect yourself. Do not underestimate your own strength. And above all, never allow anyone, even family, to convince you that you are less than you are. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need the reminder that courage has no age limit. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. And if you have your own experience of resilience or betrayal, I invite you to share it below.